Hello everybody, this is Mr. S, and today we're talking about PowerPoint 2.7, Changes in the Ecosystem, Ecological Succession. So our objectives, essential knowledges, and skills are a few things. For one thing, the essential knowledge is that there are two main types of ecological succession, primary and secondary succession. Second one, a keystone species in an ecosystem is a species whose activities have a particularly significant role in determining community structure. Third one, an indicator species is a plant or animal that, by its presence, abundance, scarcity, or chemical composition, demonstrates that some distinctive aspects of the character or quality of an ecosystem is present. And then pioneer members of an early successional species commonly move into unoccupied habitat over time and adapt to its particular conditions, which may result in the origin of new species. Succession in a disturbed ecosystem will affect the total biomass, species richness, and net productivity over time. So, we also want to know to be able to describe the effects of ecological succession on ecosystems. And at the end, you're going to be practicing data analysis by explaining patterns and trends in data to draw conclusions. And hopefully you'll be able to describe ecological succession. So have your notes out, read over these again, pause the video, and that's what we're doing. Alright, so succession is a natural and gradual change in the types of species that live in an area. It can be primary or secondary. It's the gradual replacement of one plant community by another through natural processes over time. Okay, so we have two different types, and the first one is primary succession. I'm sorry, the words got put off a little bit here, but I'll tell you what they are. So primary succession is in a place that has no soil. That's a key thing to remember. So on the side of a volcano after it erupted, after a landslide, if there was flooding, it starts with the arrival of airborne pioneer species, vocab word, such as lichens that do not need soil to survive. So these are important terminology to understand, and we'll get into lichens. So, for example, this would be a good candidate for primary succession. Any kind of bare rock or place where soil doesn't exist. Here would be another one, volcano exploding. You have all this rock and earth that needs to be colonized by fungi and lichens and broken down into soil. So it's like nothing has been living there before. And these are lichens. So we'll see these all over the Sandia Mountains in Albuquerque. I wonder if you've seen these before. But they actually are a symbiotic organism that have algae, fungi, and bacteria that all living as one being, so that they can break down the minerals in the rocks and also photosynthesize and create their own energy. Then they exchange the minerals and the sunlight energy. And the oldest organisms on Earth are lichens. There's some that are hundreds of thousands of years old that are still alive, which is pretty amazing. So they're the first things that start to create soil. And so in primary succession, soil starts to form as lichens, weather, and erosion break down rock. And when the lichens die, they decompose, which adds small amounts of organic matter to the rock to make soil. So these are pretty magical creatures, and they're such beautiful colors. You can also use them for natural dyes sometimes. Simple plants like mosses and ferns can grow in the new soil, and then the simple plants die, adding more organic matter to the soil. Then the soil layer starts to thicken, and grasses, wildflowers, and other plants begin to take over. Then these plants die and they add more nutrients to the soil, and then eventually shrubs and trees can start to survive. So there's a very set pattern of organisms that move in and start to create the soil. Then you will have insects, small birds, and mammals have begun to move in. So what was now a bare rock is now supporting a variety of life. And that's primary succession. Now, secondary succession begins when there was already a soil and it was already an ecosystem. And then this is faster and has different pioneer species than primary succession. And it usually starts with a natural disaster. So like a forest fire, what you would see is which plants are the first to move in, and then which are the next ones to move in, and the next ones, and how does the ecosystem regrow from what it already was. So here's a picture of how succession might work in a typical forest ecosystem. You would have like weeds and little flowers and grasses, and then they would start to be more thick and overgrown and be building the soil. You get shrubs next, then you'd get trees, and then you'd reach the final, what we call climax community. And we're going to get into that. But it'll reach a point where it's stable. It's not changing anymore. So here's an example of a forest fire. This could be New Mexico, right? And you see all these shrubs and little plants that are growing in. I think a lot of you maybe have seen this. Okay, and then here's another image. All right, so just a reminder, it's a good idea to look at a lot of different diagrams on Google. Google search secondary succession, and this is, for example, this is a really good one because it shows how many years it takes to get to a mature hardwood forest in this specific forest, and how it's a long process. Here's another example. Now, a climax community is a stable group of plants and animals that is the end result of succession progress. Doesn't always mean big trees, but it does mean that it's no longer developing as succession. It's reached its final stage. So this would be a desert climax community, for example. So there was a disturbance here, like a fire, and it's reached its final, most developed stage of its life. All right, would this be primary or secondary? Primary, because we started off with bare rock. There was no soil. All right, so an indicator species gives early warning signs of damage or danger to a community. So for example, birds, butterflies, and amphibians are all indicator species. So if all the birds are dying or something, it's a bad sign. We call it a canary in a coal mine, that something bad is happening to the whole ecosystem. And we've seen that amphibians are declining globally, and it's a big, huge topic and issue. There's habitat loss and fragmentation, loss of wetlands, especially deforestation, droughts, pollution. Their skin is really susceptible to pollution, UV radiation. There's parasitism that they deal with, overhunting, and non-native species. And there's a fungus it's called the chytrid fungus, that's all over the world, that is causing a huge decline in the frogs. So it's a pretty intense and scary thing that the frogs are in decline. All right, and then we talked about this a little bit, but a keystone species has a huge impact on the community. If removed, a lot more than other species. So pollinators, apex predators, so wolves. If you take a wolf out, the deer population and elk population skyrocket. They eat all of the vegetation, the mice, the rabbits. The coyotes don't get eaten as much without wolves. So that means if there are more coyotes, there are less rabbits, there are less mice. which means there are less falcons, there are less hawks, there are less owls. So the wolf is a great example of an apex predator keystone species. It controls everything from the top down in the ecosystem, and also decomposers. So the keystone is this stone, and if you were to take this stone out, this whole thing would totally collapse, right? It's totally dependent on this top stone. So if you lose a keystone species, the food webs and nutrient cycles are disrupted, populations crashes, there are extinctions. So for example, the sea urchin is the result of when the sea otters decline, because the sea otters keep these in control, and these guys eat everything. So they just kill the whole ecosystem if there aren't enough otters. So there's our sea otter. It feeds on sea urchins and controls their population so that urchins would otherwise deplete the habitat's kelp. And kelp is the producer. It's the major source of food for the whole ecosystem and shelter for the ecosystem. An American alligator is also one because its tails make burrows, and it's a top predator, so it controls a lot of the populations. Beavers, they build wetlands, right? They're habitat engineers. So in this picture you'll see this is the largest beaver dam in the world. It's a huge beaver dam. They've created this ecosystem, right? All right, and then another example is a red mangrove. It protects the soil from erosion, and it's a nursery and a shelter for small animals, including reef fish and bees, pollination. If you don't have pollination, then the plants will die. All right, so this is in your packet, and I want you to practice looking at the graph below and explaining whether spruce trees are an early, middle, or late successional species. Have they reached their climax based on this graph? What do you see in this data? Put it in your notes. Thank you for being here. Adios.